Hey everyone. Tonight we begin in a rice field gone quiet, where the wind rustles through empty stalks and a child digs through dust for something that will never grow. You've heard of Mao Zedong, the great liberator, the man who made the revolution walk on two legs. But what happened after the marches stopped? What if I told you China once melted its cooking pots to chase steel dreams? While millions starved within reach of full granaries that, in the name of progress, even grief had to be reported, and silence became the only safe language. This wasn't just a failed campaign. It was ideology served cold, hope broken into quotas, and hunger used as proof of devotion. If peeling back history's deepest wounds helps you rest, please like and subscribe. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what silence in your life still echoes loudest? You find yourself standing at the precipice of a momentous era, the late 1950s. The year is 1958, just 9 years after a seismic shift in power swept across China. A figure of immense influence, Chairman Mao Zedong, held the reins, driven by a singular, all-consuming vision. He saw his ancient, vast nation languishing in what he perceived as an almost medieval state of underdevelopment. This perception fueled a fervent desire to propel China forward, to drag it, perhaps even by force, into the modern age. His solution, a program of breathtaking ambition, was christened the Great Leap Forward. Imagine a collective gasp across the land as the announcement rings out an ambitious plan to industrialize both bustling towns and the sprawling countryside. A grand undertaking intended to shepherd China into the promised land of a socialist paradise. The timeline, in retrospect, seems impossibly swift. Less than 15 years, they declared, a bold, almost audacious promise, painting a future of abundance and progress. But as you observe, a disquieting truth begins to settle over the landscape. This dream, so vividly painted and ardently pursued, soon began to curdle, transforming into a nightmare of unimaginable scale. It wasn't merely a setback. It was a descent into a hellish reality that ensnared an astonishing 650 million Chinese people. The nation, once vibrant with the promise of newfound prosperity, plunged headlong into economic chaos. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, giving way to an unprecedented famine. The air thickens with a heavy sense of dread as the numbers begin to accumulate, a grim tally of lives lost. The terrible death toll, whispered now in hushed tones, reached an estimated 45 million souls, a number so vast it almost defies comprehension. Yet, even as the echoes of this catastrophe linger, Mao remains an almost untouchable icon. Revered as the founding father of Red China, his image, carefully preserved, is seen as the very glue that holds the nation together, lending legitimacy to the authorities who govern even today. To protect this carefully constructed image, the Chinese Communist Party has maintained a deafening silence on this profound tragedy. For more than 5 decades, an impenetrable curtain of secrecy has descended, obscuring the horrors of that time. You feel the weight of this silence, a collective forgetting that gnaws at the edges of memory. But now, as if a soft wind is finally stirring the dust of history, a curtain begins to rise, ever so slightly, on this bloody episode. To truly comprehend how the Great Leap Forward could have caused the deaths of tens of millions, we must journey further back, to the very origins of the communist regime itself. Rewind the clock to January 1949, a pivotal moment in Chinese history. Imagine red flags unfurling over Beijing as the Red Army triumphantly enters the city. A new era is dawning, heralded by the central government of the People's Republic. a regime that declared its intent to make a clean, decisive break with the past. The task they faced was, frankly, monumental. You sense the sheer weight of their ambition. They sought to dismantle centuries of tradition, reshape deeply ingrained mindsets, and eradicate the archaic ways of life that characterized an old-fashioned, agrarian society. Beyond this grand social engineering, they also vowed to stamp out the endemic famines that had plagued China for generations, those recurring processions of misery that had scarred the land. The Chinese people, weary from decades of conflict and hardship, harbored immense expectations from their new regime. You can almost feel their collective hope, the yearning for a better life. They had heard the communists promise to construct a fairer, more equitable society, a utopia free from want. To realize these ambitious plans, Mao, the leader, embarked on a significant journey. You see him traveling to Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Empire, to seek vital economic assistance. This visit was not merely about aid. It was a crucial step in solidifying the strategic alliance with the USSR. You observe a curious dynamic between the two communist giants. The Chinese leader, Mao, harbored immense admiration for his Soviet counterpart, Stalin, viewing him as a revolutionary beacon. Yet, you perceive a subtle disdain from Stalin, who, in a calculated power play, made Mao wait a full 2 days before granting him an audience. Despite this slight, the two countries ultimately signed a treaty of friendship, a pact that would profoundly shape China's destiny. Under its terms, the USSR committed to supplying China with enormous quantities of armaments, fully equipped factories, industrial and farming equipment, and a steady stream of advisors across various fields. You recognize that this treaty, while offering much-needed assistance, also inherently sealed China's dependence. The aid, after all, did not come without a hefty price tag. China, you learn, committed itself not only to remaining firmly within Moscow's sphere of influence, but also to faithfully adhering to its economic model. More significantly, it undertook the daunting obligation to repay the colossal debt it had contracted. You sense the seeds of future challenges being sown, even amidst the initial promises of prosperity. Less than a year after their ascent to power, the Chinese communists took their first decisive step toward emulating the Soviet model. You witnessed the beginning of massive agricultural reform, a policy that reverberated through the very foundations of rural life. This sweeping initiative impacted half of all cultivated land across China, immediately benefiting an astonishing 300 million poor peasants. Imagine their faces, etched with generations of hardship, as they received their own plots of land. These land redistributions, however, became more than just an economic adjustment. They served as an unexpected opportunity for the settling of old scores, encouraged, or perhaps subtly incited, by the party, the poor peasants, who for 2 millennia had endured suffering and humiliation. Now, for the first time, began to raise their heads. You can almost hear their simmering resentment finally given free rein, as class violence erupted. Over 1 million landowners, previously the pillars of rural society, were executed. It was a brutal, swift, and undeniable reshaping of the social order. For the Chinese peasants, the period between 1950 and 1952, immediately following these land distributions, proved to be their most prosperous 2 years. You observe a tangible improvement in their daily lives. In 1950, they were still impoverished. Yet from 1952 onwards, life visibly improved. You hear the testimony of a survivor, his voice a nostalgic echo from the past. In my home region, we were farming land which was ours, and we had enough to eat. We gave part of our harvest to the state, and we kept the rest for ourselves. He continues, I was young at the time, but I could feel that life was improving. The villages organized all sorts of artistic activities during the new year. You see images of festive gatherings, of communities coming alive with newfound hope. But then, a subtle shift in his tone, a hint of melancholy. But later, all that was stopped. Mao, the proclaimed liberator of China and the peasants, was revered as a god of the harvests, worshipped almost as the emperor of this new Red dynasty. His image, omnipresent, adorned homes and public spaces. Yet, you sense a subtle unease beginning to ripple through the party leadership. From 1953, these very land redistributions, which had brought initial prosperity and adoration for Mao, began to stir a new fear in him, the potential reappearance of a class of small landowners. A nascent, rural bourgeoisie that could challenge the party's control. And so, following the model of the Soviet kolkhozes, those vast collective farms the party began to persuade, then compel, the peasants to combine their newly acquired plots into larger collectives, often comprising up to 50 families. This new step, you observe, was met with deep mistrust. It meant returning the land they had been so recently given, surrendering it back to the community. You feel the apprehension, the quiet resistance, as individual ownership gave way to collective control. Despite this burgeoning skepticism, Mao stubbornly judged the Stalinist model as the ideal, a path he believed China must follow, even as the Soviet tyrant, Stalin himself, died in this very same year of 1953. The stage was set for another drastic shift. Then, an extraordinary event sent shockwaves reverberating throughout the socialist world. You are transported to February 1956 to the 20th Party Congress in Moscow. There, Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, delivered his famous secret speech. In a stunning public denunciation, he systematically exposed the crimes of Stalin, tearing down the very edifice of his personality cult and laying bare the disastrous consequences of his collectivization campaigns. You feel the immediate impact of this revelation in China. The Stalinist model, so ardently praised and pursued by Mao, was suddenly, publicly, discredited. The ambitious campaign of agricultural collectivization in China was abruptly suspended, and Mao's cherished ideas, once dogma, now found themselves out of favor, questioned even within his own party. But Mao, ever the shrewd tactician, was accustomed to navigating internal party challenges. You observe his characteristic response when problems arose within the party. He invariably turned to the people, leveraging their support to regain the upper hand. He decided to invite the entire country to express themselves freely, to criticize the leadership openly. He called this audacious initiative the 100 Flowers Campaign. You watch, almost breathlessly, as this campaign takes an unexpected and, for Mao, deeply troubling turn. Intellectuals, initially delighted by this perceived exercise in democracy, seized the opportunity with fervor. They began to voice not just minor criticisms, but fundamental objections to the very nature of the communist regime itself. Their critiques, sharp and unsparing, challenged the party's authority and direction. For Mao, whose true hidden aim was to flush out his critics, the strategy, in a perverse way, worked. He had exposed them. You see him publicly identify all those who had spoken against the regime as class enemies. The atmosphere shifts dramatically. from an illusion of freedom to one of sudden, chilling repression. You hear the echoes of the official denunciations, the harsh accusations leveled against those who dared to speak their minds. You're wrong. What are your political opinions? Do you realize what you're saying? Are you a teacher of the people or not? Do you take the point of view of a teacher of the people? The questions, seemingly innocuous, masked a profound threat. Mao, without hesitation, ordered a violent repression. The slightest wrong word, you realize, could be fatal. Between 500,000 and 1 million people, predominantly teachers and intellectuals, were labeled as rightists. Their lives irrevocably altered. They were deported to forced labor camps, places of unimaginable hardship where many would ultimately perish from starvation, disease, and brutal conditions. 3,000 of these dissidents were sent to the infamous Jiabiangu labor camp, situated on the remote, unforgiving edge of the Gobi Desert, a so-called re-education camp. It became a mass grave. You feel a shiver of dread as you learn of the horror their bodies, buried in shallow graves, were covered with only a thin layer of sand. Over time, the desert wind, ceaseless and indifferent, would gradually erode the earth, bringing their skeletal remains back to the surface, a silent testament to the brutal regime. These tragic remains, even just a few years ago, were still emerging from the sands, mute witnesses to a forgotten cruelty. A climate of terror permeated every layer of society, reaching even the highest levels of leadership. You observe that in 1957 and 1958, entire heads of provinces were summarily removed and replaced by ruthless, unscrupulous men. These new cadres, hungry for power, were often eager to benefit from the radical winds blowing from Beijing, embracing the repression with chilling enthusiasm. The suppression of the rightists effectively eliminated all organized opposition, clearing the path for the great leap forward. The Communist Party, now unburdened by internal dissent, could act with unchecked authority because no one dared speak out anymore. By silencing his enemies, Mao regained total control of the party, solidifying his position as the supreme leader. You shift your gaze to November 1957 as Mao Zedong once again journeys to Moscow. His long-standing ally, Khrushchev, had now become his main rival on the world stage, particularly in the grand competition of socialist progress. You hear Khrushchev's audacious declaration, the Soviet Union's economic production, he proclaimed, would surpass that of the United States in a mere 15 years. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down on the global stage. Mao, never one to be outdone, readily took up this challenge. You see the glint in his eye, the competitive fire ignited. He declared with equal, if not greater, audacity that China's steel production would not only catch up, but exceed that of the United Kingdom within that same ambitious 15-year period. It was a promise that would reshape the very fabric of Chinese society. To achieve this incredible feat, an unprecedented mobilization began. 100 million peasants, a staggering number, were recruited from every corner of the vast country. You see them, almost with their bare hands, engaged in building projects on an epic scale. Imagine the sheer human endeavor, the construction of new roads crisscrossing the land, railways stretching into the horizon, massive dams designed to harness the power of mighty rivers, and intricate canals weaving through the countryside. For Mao, there was no doubt the great leap forward into a truly communist society had, in his mind, genuinely begun. The air thrummed with a new, potent slogan, "Dare to think, dare to act." It became the official line of the party, an exhortation to boundless enthusiasm and unwavering effort. Mao, a master of propaganda, symbolically appeared at these sprawling work sites, lending his immense support to the peasants. He sought to underscore the fact that he had rallied the entire party behind him. He was often accompanied by Liu Shaoqi, the party's second-in-command, and Zhou Enlai, his closest comrade in arms, projecting an image of unified leadership. Liu Shaoqi publicly confirmed his unwavering support for Mao, echoing the fervent zeal with the rallying cry, "Hard work for a few years, happiness for 1,000." Every conceivable means was employed to mobilize the masses, to stoke the fires of revolutionary zeal in what became an extraordinary, all-encompassing campaign. And then, in an almost surreal turn, Mao identified a new, unexpected enemy: sparrows. These small, ubiquitous birds were accused of eating the precious crops, thus hindering agricultural production. You witnessed the absurd reality. The Chinese people, in their millions, were called out to prevent the birds from landing, making noise, banging pots, chasing them relentlessly. The result was tragic and predictable. The sparrows died of exhaustion, their bodies littering the ground. But this victory was short-lived and hollow. The elimination of sparrows inadvertently led to the proliferation of another, far more destructive enemy: insects. With their natural predators gone, these pests multiplied unchecked, consuming a significant portion of the already strained harvest. This absurd campaign, you realize, was but one step in a relentless march towards even more radical collectivization. During one of his extensive journeys, Mao Zedong encountered a sight that ignited his imagination. You picture him in a field in Henan province, where he saw a banner praising the merits of the first experimental People's Commune. This seemingly small detail sparked a monumental shift. He declared with boundless enthusiasm, his voice echoing across the land, "The People's Commune will be the bridge that will carry China towards the socialist paradise." This powerful pronouncement from the great helmsman was swiftly taken up in all provinces. In just one summer, a whirlwind of activity swept across the countryside, and thousands of communes were rapidly formed. You envision these vast new entities, each consisting of up to 2,000 families, their lives now inextricably linked. There were even grand, almost utopian plans for enormous communes, combining an astonishing 10 to 20,000 households, all to be headed by cadres utterly dedicated to Mao's vision. Within these communes, daily life was transformed into a relentless, singular pursuit of production. Working days began at the first hint of dawn, stretching tirelessly until well after dark. The relentless toil was often accompanied by blaring music, songs praising the glory of the great leap forward, a constant auditory backdrop to the grueling labor. As the fundamental unit of this envisioned future society, the commune experimented with a completely new way of life. Here, everything was meticulously designed to immerse the individual entirely in a collective existence, one geared solely towards maximizing production. You witnessed the profound changes. All private property, once the bedrock of rural life, was abolished. Houses, livestock, the very land they tilled, even their cherished production tools, all became collective property. This radical communalization extended to the most intimate aspects of life. Nurseries and free, compulsory schools were established, explicitly designed to liberate women from their traditional maternal duties, freeing them to work in the fields, contributing their labor to the collective. You hear the voice of a survivor, recalling her youthful fervor. At that time, I was very young. I was a member of the Youth League and in charge of propaganda. So that shows that I believed in communism. I thought communism was fantastic. When we were tiny, we were taught that the communist paradise would soon come, and we only had to endure a little suffering and make a few sacrifices to reach it. That was how I saw them. There's a faint, almost childlike laughter, a distant memory of youthful idealism. "Socialism is good," she murmurs. "Something like that. But I can't really remember. Did you sing different songs when you were at home?" "We only sang in school." Outside life was very hard. There was never any let-up. Why would we want to sing? The family unit, you realize, virtually disappeared. Children were made to live by the new rules of collective life, their individual identities subsumed by the communal machine. The individual, once a person with hopes and dreams, became nothing more than a cog in a vast, impersonal machine. Even intimate relationships were rigidly controlled. Men and women were separated, grouped into dormitories. Sexual relationships were severely regulated. Married couples were often prevented from living together. Some desperate couples sought clandestine moments of intimacy in the fields. But if caught, they faced public humiliation, a brutal shaming ritual designed to enforce conformity. For some women, the unbearable psychological pressure, coupled with the relentless hardship, led to tragic outcomes. Many committed suicide. The household items, indeed, were pooled. In the first year, furniture was seized, destined for firewood, and anything that could be destroyed was destroyed. Pigs, sheep, even the smallest livestock, everything was collectivized. Even the pots and pans, essential tools for family life, were seized. Why? Because families were no longer allowed to cook at home. No one cooked in their own houses anymore. The aim was clear: to force the peasants to take all their meals in the commune's collective canteens. In some of these canteens, money itself was abolished, replaced by a system of work points. Food was distributed not according to need, but according to merit, that is, each person's capacity to fulfill the demanding production objectives. The very notion of wages, of personal compensation for labor, simply disappeared. Attendance at work became compulsory, an unbending rule. You imagine the fear of missing a day. If your name wasn't on the attendance list, you were punished. And crucially, you lost work points. Yes, a survivor confirms, his voice weary with memory. But without work points, you had nothing to eat. The fewer work points you earned, the less food they gave you. He pauses, a deep sigh. I can tell you that life was brutal for everyone at that time, except the cadres. Those people lived well. The party cadres, positioned at the top of this new hierarchy, became the veritable officers of the people's communes, which rapidly transformed into real barracks. Every day, the peasants underwent military training, a constant reminder that the masses had to be mobilized, not just for production, but for national defense. Each morning, they gathered at the village entrance, waiting for the group leader to allocate the day's back-breaking tasks. At the end of the day, the leader would simply shout, "Work's over," and the exhausted peasants would shuffle off to eat. You sense the creeping disillusionment. They weren't motivated. Productivity, far from increasing, remained stubbornly low. This lack of incentive, you realize, was a significant reason why productivity in the people's communes failed to meet expectations. Peasants had no right to free speech, no voice in the decisions that governed their lives. Their inherent skills, their deep understanding of the land and its rhythms, were no longer taken into consideration. Everything was decided by the authorities, who, more often than not, knew nothing about farming. They decided everything: the precise distance between each rice seedling, the specific type of seed to be used, the exact amount of fertilizer required. Land perfectly suitable for one type of crop was, by arbitrary decree, used for another. The result was predictable. The peasants became totally demotivated, their spirit crushed, and the ensuing poor harvests caused the first ominous food shortages. But Mao, fueled by an insatiable ambition, always wanted more. To artificially inflate agricultural production figures, he pitted communes against each other in a fierce, counterproductive competition. The communes that recorded the biggest, most unbelievable harvests were lavishly rewarded in elaborate ceremonies organized by the party. You witnessed the cruel irony, while the inhabitants of these successful communes were often terribly short of food themselves. Their leaders were celebrated for achievements that were, in truth, entirely fabricated. This was a world where the pursuit of record production, a phenomenon known as launching a satellite, went hand in hand with announcing wildly falsified figures. The cadres, caught in an escalating spiral of demand from above, felt immense pressure to lie. You hear a chilling anecdote from a survivor, once a cadre himself. At the provincial meeting, my superiors asked me what I thought about it all. Some places have launched plenty of satellites and declared high levels of production. What do you think? He continues. My back was against the wall, and I had to say that I would respect the quotas without fail. But in reality, I couldn't keep those commitments. You recall the infamous images, meticulously designed to deceive. Soviet advisors were shown a field of wheat where the ears were supposedly so extraordinarily close together and bountiful that they could support the weight of 6 people standing upon them. The photograph, a testament to the lie, was brazenly splashed on the front page of the People's Daily. Everyone, from the highest echelons of power to the common person, was fooled, or, more accurately, those who weren't were too terrified to expose the con. Lying became common practice, a necessary evil at all levels of the hierarchy. The figures for both agricultural and industrial production were systematically falsified across the entire country, manipulated to meet and even grotesquely exceed the ambitious, impossible targets set by the party. By the autumn of 1958, even though official reports boasted of abundant wheat, a stark reality was setting in. There was a desperate shortage of food. Follow a group of investigators to the town of Dangshang in the region of Shaanxi, a place that proudly boasted about its good harvest. Instead of fields overflowing with grain, you discover a horrifying deception. It was supposed to be a fertile area where the cereals were on the top, but underneath was just straw. The reality was a carefully constructed facade, concealing the emptiness within. As a direct consequence of these wild exaggerations, the tax paid in grain by the communes was calculated on a false basis. In some regions, the brutal result was that the state demanded almost all of the amounts actually harvested, leaving the peasants with virtually nothing. To make matters worse, the spring harvest in 1959 was a devastating disaster. The wheat, barely cut from the fields, was immediately, relentlessly collected. You see all the members of the commune, young and old, forced to carry the meager crops on their backs to a waiting boat, which swiftly took them away. They often did this at night, by the flickering light of torches. As soon as the crops were gathered, The wheat was taken away. A survivor recounts, his voice filled with quiet despair. Yes, they were shipping it out to pay debts. When asked who demanded the repayment, he responded, "How would I know? The cadres said that at every harvest. Deng Xiaoping said debts had to be repaid, even if the country was very poor." The infamous debt, you learn, was the one China had contracted with the USSR for the purchase of hundreds of factories, delivered ready for use. Beijing, in turn, undertook to repay Moscow in agricultural produce. Mao, in a shocking display of disregard for human life, wanted to accelerate this repayment, even if it meant people starving in the countryside. In some regions, the scarcity was so profound that people truly had nothing to eat. You hear of horrific accounts. "I was sent out of the village on a mission, but the members of my family who stayed behind were reduced to eating the bark of medlar trees." The words hang heavy in the air, a stark image of desperation. They ate tree bark. They ate the roots of banana trees too, anything they could find. The hunger was so intense that people even resorted to eating mud, a sort of white clay or the tough stems of rice. "We were so hungry," another survivor recalls, "that we filled our stomachs with whatever we could find." The stories deepen in their tragedy. Once I saw an adult collapse. He fell to the ground while trying to eat a sort of bean paste. He died in front of me, and he still had the food in his mouth. You feel the profound injustice, the quiet horror of a life extinguished while still grasping for sustenance. Soon afterwards, the desperation escalated. We started eating the leaves of that tree. As you delve deeper, you discover that in other provinces, the crippling shortage of food bestowed the cadres, who controlled its distribution, the power of life or death over the inhabitants of the commune. In theory, peasants were entitled to a meager 250 grams, roughly 9 ounces, of food per day. But the cadres, corrupt and self-serving, allocated themselves far more, shamelessly stuffing themselves while others withered. Those who dared to displease the leader of a production team, or those who simply didn't comply with his arbitrary orders, were deliberately starved to death. "He who does not work shall not eat," was the brutal principle applied from 1958 to 1962. This meant that entire categories of people, deemed unfit, too weak, or vulnerable, including pregnant women and the elderly, were deliberately cut off from the collective canteens and starved to death. This, you realize, qualifies as nothing less than murder. The cruelty of the cadres was chillingly clear. One survivor recalls, "I remember that when they caught some peasants who had stolen some roots from the fields, they tied them up from head to foot." The collective canteens, intended as sources of sustenance, were twisted into weapons in the hands of the cadres who managed them. You hear of a particularly harrowing account, documented by a historian, the case of a man in charge of a collective canteen, a village in Qinghai province. One day, he summoned a woman, described as very beautiful, who was suffering terribly from the famine. The cadre, exercising his monstrous power, asked her how many days it had been since she had eaten. Then, he ordered her to undress. When he saw her naked, he mocked her. "Why, your breasts shriveled." The woman, her voice full of despair, replied, "My chest is now as flat as a man's." The cadre then demanded that she bring him her daughter. Her daughter was very young, yet the mother, desperate for food, accepted in exchange for 2 miserable loaves of bread. The woman, unable to bear the horror and shame, committed suicide soon afterwards. In the spring of 1959, Mao's fervent drive took yet another, even more frenzied, form. The great helmsman demanded an unimaginable 100 million tons of steel within the next 3 years. Since the production from the official steel factories was woefully insufficient, the peasants, already starving, were now also conscripted to contribute to this industrial effort. They were ordered to make small blast furnaces out of whatever crude materials they could find. To make the small blast furnaces, a survivor explains, we used mud mixed with hair to make it stronger. The desperation extended to the most intimate levels. Many female comrades had to cut their hair. My youngest daughter also had to cut her hair, and she cried. Poor child. But it was compulsory. Nearly all the trees in China, you realize, were ruthlessly cut down for fuel. Forests were razed to the ground, and people were forced to melt down their precious pots and kitchen utensils, even school bells. The entire population was exploited in an utterly absurd way. Everyone was doing anything, everything, contributing to a society that had plunged into an indescribable madness. Officially, China began to report producing millions and millions of tons of steel. But in reality, all that emerged from these makeshift foundries was unusable metal, brittle and worthless. These small blast furnaces worked day and night, mobilizing tens of millions of peasants for absolutely nothing. Steel is one of these magic indicators of progress within the socialist world. A historian explains. The consequence, of course, is that the farmers are worked literally to death, and the grain is taken literally out of their mouth. But that's a price worth paying in Mao's view. You are shown images of the top leadership meeting in Shanghai, dining, drinking wine, buying expensive cameras, being entertained. The idea that Mao was somehow unaware of the mass famine raging in the countryside is, you are told, a complete myth. A top-secret document, painstakingly unearthed from the archives, reveals a chilling truth. Not only was Mao completely aware of the peasants' distress, but it was, horrifyingly, part of his strategy. He deliberately chose to sacrifice the countryside in order to feed the cities and the industrial and political centers, ensuring the stability of his power base. This document, a report on the debates in a Politburo session dated March 25, 1959, reveals Mao's monstrous calculus. He stated, chillingly, "When there is not enough to eat, people starve to death. It is better to let half of the people die so that the other half can eat their fill." And at that very same conference in Shanghai, he actually orders procurements of grain to be increased to 1/3, an unheard-of level. He says it very clearly, a historian confirms. If you take up to 1/3 of the grain, the farmers will not rebel. He makes available thousands of trucks to go and carry out that task. In July 1959, Mao gathered the leaders of the party in Lushan, far from the bustling capital of Beijing. The original objective of this conference, you learn, was to correct the increasingly apparent issues with the Great Leap Forward. Yet, only one man dared to speak truth to power. This was the famous Marshal Peng Dehuai, the son of a peasant. He was deeply upset by the widespread destruction in people's lives caused by Mao's disastrous policy. He expressed his concerns in an open letter to Mao, a plea that echoed with quiet desperation, "Please think of the people." This courageous act, however, was perceived as an unforgivable insult by Mao. In a swift and brutal display of power, he forced Peng Dehuai to resign from his post as Minister of Defense. This episode, you realize, marked a tragic reality no one else would dare to openly defy Mao. as he persisted in his relentless, misguided policies. The years that followed were truly terrible. You are taken to the north of China, to regions ravaged by famine. As soon as we arrived, we saw the houses were empty, totally deserted. People were lying on mats with empty stomachs and their bodies swollen from lack of food. We could see they were dying of starvation. It was obvious. In one particular county, 120,000 people died out of a total population of 1 million. Around 1 in 10 perished from starvation. Countless others suffered from edema, a swelling caused by severe malnutrition. To spend your days with nothing to eat, you got very thin, a survivor explains. And as you got thinner, at a certain point, you had swelling. You'd be so swollen that it scared people. You had bruises all over your body, and in those cases, you shouldn't eat salt or suffer constipation after eating mud to ease their hunger. The individual tragedies pile up, each a testament to the quiet horror. He didn't even have a coffin to bury my grandfather in, so we buried him directly in the earth. Often, they died by the road, far from their families, who themselves were too weak to bury them. One survivor remembers finding a child's body. Oh my God, I came across another body, a child's that time. It gave me such a frightening. The voice trails off, the memory too painful to complete. The most shocking part of all this, you discover, is that the population wasn't starving to death because of a complete lack of food. The state's granaries, vast and well-stocked, were full. In the time of the dynasties, you learn, the emperors would typically open these reserves and distribute food to the people in distress. Conversely, the leadership of the Communist Party, a regime that claimed to serve the people, refused to help its starving populace. They kept the full granaries sealed, while entire populations camped around them, begging. "Communist Party, give us a little food," they would cry, until starvation finished them off. It was unimaginable. The regions where the famine raged were cordoned off. It was strictly forbidden for people or information to circulate. A deliberate attempt to conceal the truth. But many still sought to escape. The few people who could move about saw with their own eyes that the destitution was widespread. When the train stopped in the station, I saw crowds of starving people stretching their hands through the windows to ask for food. Everyone was suffering from hunger at that time. All those people were fleeing the famine children. Old people, they all ran around the train to beg food from the passengers. From 1958 onwards, the cities were quite literally protected from the countryside. People were not allowed to move about freely. A farmer who wanted to bring a cow to market needed a permit from his local cadre. Those who tried to flee the countryside were summarily sent back. Mao's radical methods caught the attention of his Soviet counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev, who received reports from his advisors on the ground. During the grandiose ceremonies for the 10th anniversary of the Chinese Revolution, Khrushchev took Mao aside. He pleaded with him, in vain, not to repeat the excesses of Stalinist collectivization. Khrushchev would later recount that Mao believed he was an envoy of God, charged with the divine task of building socialism before the Soviet Union could. Mao, arrogant and unyielding, ignored Khrushchev's warnings. He gave the order not just to carry on, but to increase the production figures, convinced they were necessary for the successes of the Great Leap Forward. 9 months later, the simmering tensions erupted. Khrushchev suspended cooperation agreements with China and repatriated 15,000 Soviet advisors. It was the beginning of the devastating split between the two communist giants. Meanwhile, in China, Liu Shaoqi, elected president of the Republic in April 1959, cautiously tried to restrain Mao, who remained chairman of the party. But another year would pass before Liu Shaoqi finally ordered investigations into the grim reality of the famine on the ground. I went to investigate in Chengzhou, the biggest county in the Shaanxi region, because I wanted to know what was really going on. A former official recounts. It wasn't under my jurisdiction. It was under Chang. When the local leader found out that I was investigating, he told me lies. He ordered all the people I saw to repeat the same about the death toll from starvation. He said that in total 90,000 people had died unnatural deaths. And the truth, he knew, was far darker. In reality, the total was 120,000 people. As we said at the time, you couldn't say they had died of starvation. He instructed each district to declare a certain number of deaths so that the total never exceeded 90,000. All that was to hide the truth from us. 3 high-ranking officials independently initiated their own investigations. Their findings were horrifying, several tens of millions dead from starvation. They compiled a detailed report for Mao and Zhou Enlai. Frank de Cotter, a historian, has accessed certain testimonies from those very investigations. These documents, he reveals, confirm terrible realities, corroborating the grim report of these 3 high-ranking officials. There is a very detailed report by a high-ranking military officer who returns to his home village in Hunan. He discovers that the graves in the fields have been tampered with. They've been opened, and the bodies inside are gone. He wonders what is going on. On a rainy day, he sees smoke coming out of the local party secretary's house. He walks up, opens the door, and sees 4 large pots in which human body parts are being boiled down. It turns out that the local party secretary had decided that you could actually recycle human bodies, simmer them, and then use the gruesome concoction as fertilizer on the fields. Thousands of cases of cannibalism were recorded, their chilling details hidden away in the archives. You learn of one case where people ate their own dead relatives. A mother, before she died, said to her daughter, "There's nothing left of my body to eat, just my heart. When I die, you can eat my heart." In another case in Hunan province, very well documented by a top working team sent into the countryside, they discovered that a man was forced to bury his own child alive because this child had also stolen some food. The father, who was forced to bury that child, died of grief 3 weeks later. The scale of human depravity and desperation is almost unbearable. In the spring of 1961, President Liu Shaoqi himself went to investigate, spending over a month in his home province of Hunan. He was devastated to discover that friends and members of his own family had perished from starvation without him knowing about it, because the local cadres had deliberately hidden the truth from him. He was deeply upset. For Liu, the Great Leap Forward simply had to be stopped. But it was only in 1962 that the party finally brought together 7,000 cadres from all across the country to put an end to the crazy undertaking of the Great Leap Forward. Liu Shaoqi, in a moment of extraordinary courage, stated publicly that the party was largely responsible for the famine. He directly contradicted Mao on this issue, as Mao had consistently estimated the harmful aspects of the party's policy to be only 10% of the reason for the famine. Although the famine continued to claim victims until the end of 1962, the situation slowly began to improve with the re-establishment of farming on privately owned plots of land and the reopening of free markets. The radical collectivization in the countryside and the senseless quotas for farming production, as well as the absurd steel production in small blast furnaces, were all finally stopped. The Great Leap Forward was officially over. Yet, the world knew nothing about these 4 years of tragedy. The regime at the time meticulously put everything in place to hide the truth at all costs. Western journalists, working at the New China Agency, translated official articles into English. In the 1960s, these foreigners regularly took their holidays in the province of Anhui, a region heavily impacted by the famine. But for their arrival, everything was meticulously arranged. Shops around where they were staying were suddenly filled up with food. Stylishly dressed girls were conscripted to canoe on the nearby lake. The staging was magnificent, a perfect illusion. And the foreigners, upon their return, wrote articles swearing that there was no famine in China. Everything was staged to make the Western journalists believe that China was a paradise of virtue and plenty. In the same way, foreign political leaders were taken in. Returning from China in 1961, François Mitterrand, then a prominent French politician, described Mao as a humanitarian and certainly not a dictator. He reported that Mao had assured him, "The Chinese people are not on the verge of famine. I repeat, in order to be clearly understood, there is no famine in China." It was an enormous lie. The Chinese leadership knew perfectly well that their policy was killing tens of millions of people. The question of who should answer for these acts before history became a deeply dangerous issue of power, more than ever before. Liu Shaoqi was called to see Mao Zedong by his swimming pool. Liu Shaoqi made a fatal mistake when he said, "You and I are responsible for the famine, and all of it, including cannibalism, will go into the history books. History will judge us." At that precise moment, you sense, Mao already sealed the fate of Liu Shaoqi. He thought, "This man is my worst enemy." Mao didn't want to be placed in difficulty by this subject or by others. So, to regain absolute power once more, he led the Chinese youth into the destructive movement of the Cultural Revolution, targeting the very party bureaucrats who had questioned him. He took advantage of the radicalization of the situation to have Liu Shaoqi publicly criticized, and then arrested by young Red Guards, imprisoned and denied medical care. Liu died tragically in a cell in 1969. From then on, no one would dare speak of the Great Famine again, or of Mao's responsibility in this profound tragedy. Who is responsible for what happened? A historian muses. There can only be a very simple answer to that, or a very complicated one. The very simple answer is that Mao, Chairman Mao, was responsible. He initiated it. He started it. It was his vision. He stopped it. He was responsible from beginning to end. Mao ranks as one of the great mass murderers of the 20th century. He continues, "The more complicated version is, how did one man get away with all of this? So it seems to me that it is both a man and a system who are both responsible for this. It's a collective responsibility of the Communist Party of China at that time." Why, 50 years after the Great Famine, do the authorities still refuse to recognize the reality of it, to discuss it, and to draw lessons? The answer is clear. I think they are convinced that it would damage the legitimacy of the communist regime and threaten its leadership. Yet, one historian, a member of the Communist Party himself, offers a hopeful counterpoint. In my opinion, their fears are unfounded. Do you know why I wrote my book, Tombstone? I wrote this book primarily to lighten the shoulders of the Communist Party, which continues to bear the huge burden of this history. Certainly, one day it will have to rid itself of this weight. When Mao died in September 1976, he left behind a country in ruins, still grappling with the wounds of his long reign. The nation paid tribute to the great helmsman in a grand funeral. But in the vast, gathered crowd, you sense that many must have been silently thinking about their loved ones who perished in the Great Famine. Today, the figure for the death toll still divides historians, a testament to the ongoing struggle for truth. Yang Jisheng estimates that the 4 years of the Great Famine killed at least 36 million people. Frank de Cotter estimates the death toll to be at least 45 million. Other Chinese historians put forward the devastating figure of 55 million, almost the same as the total number of victims in the Second World War. There is no grand monument in China to commemorate them. Apart from this modest edifice, standing quietly in the middle of the Henan countryside, it was put up just a few years ago by a simple peasant who defied the official silence. A silent, humble memorial to an unspeakable Holocaust that the communist leadership has always sought to erase. And perhaps, as you drift from this quiet, poignant history, you can carry a piece of their memory with you, a testament to the enduring power of truth, even when buried by silence. The man known to history as Maiyong, or Chairman Mao, was born on the 26th of December 1893 in the village of Shan in the province of Hunan in southern China. His father was Mao Chang, who had been raised in a family of poverty-stricken peasants. However, after serving in the Xiang army for a few years in his youth, he had returned to his native region and began working as a farmer. He soon acquired enough money to become a lender in the district, and this combined with his agricultural work allowed him to become one of the more prosperous farmers in the Shan area, eventually coming into possession of about 20 acres of land. Mao's mother was W. Chim, a devout Buddhist who had a troubled upbringing. Her father was a poor shoemaker who drank heavily, and her mother had been his concubine. Ma's childhood was less than ideal. His father was a strict disciplinarian whose method of parenting primarily involved beating Ma and his 3 siblings. If they did not do as they were told, their mother tried to temper his outbursts, but with little effect. Young Mao developed an interest in his mother's Buddhism when he was younger. Though he soon became disenchanted with religion, and when he was just 8 years old, he was sent to the local primary school in Zan, just as the 20th century was. Donning his education, there was a mixture of traditional Chinese learning centered on Confucianism, combined with the centuries-old values of the Far East, along with a sprinkling of influences from the encroaching Western world, which could not be avoided in China by the 1900s. Additionally, the young Mao developed an interest early on in history and politics when he was 13 years old. His father arranged for him to be married to Leo, the 17-year-old daughter of another prosperous local farmer. But Mao demonstrated his rebellious streak at a young age and refused to honor the arranged marriage, causing something of a controversy in the Shan area. And as a result of this disagreement, the teenage Mao temporarily left his father's farm. Although he returned before very long, Mao was growing up at a time when China was experiencing momentous change. Like Korea and Japan to the east, China had first come into contact with European traders and religious missionaries in the 16th and early 17th centuries. And like them, the Chinese had quickly become wary of the newcomers and had restricted their contacts with them to 1 or 2 ports in the southeast of the country where a tiny amount of trade was conducted. It continued like this for nearly 2 centuries, with China remaining largely closed to a world which was modernizing. Without it, it remained highly conservative in its religious, social, and political values, changing little and continuing to be ruled by an emperor and a closed government of imperial rituals and administrators as it had been for centuries. But by the mid-19th century, China again, like Japan and Korea, could no longer prevent the Europeans with their modern warships, guns, and industrial power from interfering in their countries with the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856-1860. Britain forced China to end its self-imposed isolation, following which China experienced a flood of European contact. And with it came not just British opium, but ideas about different types of government, new economic developments, and all manner of technological innovation. Perhaps the most striking and revolutionary of these new ideas which arrived into China from the mid-19th century onwards was the knowledge that the Europeans and the Americans were not ruled by powerful monarchs and emperors anymore. Many lived under republics governed by the people. And even where some of these countries still had emperors or empresses, such as Queen Victoria in Britain, she was essentially a figurehead, and it was Parliament that actually ruled the British Empire. Moreover, these democracies were not all alike. Some were very conservative, some were more liberal, and some had different degrees of economic development. And there were also competing ideas about how they should be reformed and developed, with some wanting the wealthy to hold a great amount of power, and others who believed that power and wealth should be distributed equally throughout society. And there were more extreme ideas. Again, one of these developed in particular by the German political scientist Karl Marx. In the mid-19th century, argued that all wealth and goods should be held in communal ownership. He called this communism in early 20th century China. These ideas would soon lead to great change, as many began questioning why they were still ruled by the emperor of the nearly 300-year-old Qing dynasties. As Mao entered his teenage years, he was already reading about these political ideas he was particularly interested in. Calls for a democracy to be established in China to replace the imperial government, and also the Republican writings of Sun Yat-sen, who had become a figurehead for the Republican movement within China, would soon see these designs confirmed, just as Mao was starting at a new school in Changsha. The country was entering into a period of rapid change. Regional famines had struck parts of China in the late 1900s and early 1910s, and this combined with numerous regional uprisings throughout the country. And growing calls for a more representative government led to an army revolt in October 1911. At first, the imperial government of Emperor Pui, who was just a 6-year-old child, tried to address the grievances of the dissenters. But it soon became apparent that a more drastic shift would be necessary. After weeks of negotiations, it was determined in February 1912 that the emperor would abdicate and a new Republic of China would be established, with the imperial officer Yuan Shu Kai serving as its first president of a national government. Thus, an empire which had been in existence for centuries had ended. It was, however, very unclear in the mid-1910s exactly in what direction China's politics would now head. These were striking developments, and ones which Mao had not been entirely removed from. When the conflict erupted late in 1911, he had enlisted in the rebel army as an 18-year-old recruit. Now, in the spring of 1912, he simply returned to school, and it was around this time that he first started reading about the idea of socialism and communism as more radical forms of government. Yet he remained unconvinced that this was the best approach for China at that time. Meanwhile, his education continued. He determined at some point around 1913 that he would become a teacher, and so he enrolled in the first normal school of Hunan, widely regarded at the time as the best in the province. Here he became a popular and accomplished student, reading widely, being elected secretary of the student society, and eventually finishing as one of the highest-ranked students in the school. More pivotally, in terms of his later activities, M.A. was increasingly exposed to the socialist ideas he had first encountered a few years earlier, and over time, he began to find that he agreed more with what he read, particularly so as the environment of the first normal school was one of radical political thought, especially during China's first forays into representative government in 1997. Mao moved to Qingnao, Beijing, where one of his main influences at this time, Yang Changji, had taken a job at the Peking University. Here, Mao also took a job as a library assistant. But he was increasingly moving in circles of individuals who favored socialism and communism, or Marxism, as a solution to China's political woes, even with the establishment of the Republic. In 1912, the country had continued to experience turbulence as conservative and liberal forces fought amongst each other, and regional warlords and power groups exercised quasi-regional independence throughout the country. Marxism appealed to many at this time because the Bolsheviks, a branch of Russian communism, had secured control of the Russian government. In the autumn of 1917, just months after the fall of the autocratic Tsarist government, there perhaps many thought communism was also suitable for China, which had just done away with its own fossilized autocratic imperial government. Mao was increasingly leaning towards that viewpoint himself. In 1918 and 1919, an outlook which was compounded when he experienced the bourgeois hostility of the Beijing upper and middle class towards a country boy like himself. It was in Beijing that Mao's awakening as a political radical fully occurred. China was drifting ever further into political anarchy. In the late 1910s, as a buoyant nationalist movement led by Sun Yat-sen sought to rejuvenate the republic in its infancy, which the nationalist perceived as being governed by a weak conservative regime with too many links to the old imperial past. In parts of the country, the government could exercise its authority, but in others, it was little more than a government in name. Only, this instability was augmented when the Chinese government failed to secure the former German concession of Shandong at the Versailles peace negotiations in Paris. Following the end of the First World War, the nationalists considered it an affront to national pride. When this piece of mainland China was instead granted to Japan, a nation which had been exercising its strength across East Asia since the late 19th century, when it had modernized in a far more successful manner than China, and the Shandong controversy was a direct cause of a major student protest, which occurred in Beijing on the 4th of May, 1919. This was driven by a younger generation of political activists like M.A., who were tired of China's seeming impotence on the world stage and disordered internal politics. The movement would continue afterwards and led indirectly to the Chinese Civil War. Many years later, the May 4th movement. The awakening of China's younger generations to radical politics is generally seen as the origins of the Communist Party of China. The events of 1919 led many young Chinese people who were interested in politics to increasingly turn their backs on the Western liberals of Britain, France, and America, who had betrayed them on Shandong, and increasingly to turn towards the Marxism and Leninism that was gradually winning the Russian Civil War and cementing its control over Russia. As we have seen, Mao was already interested in communism by 1919, but it was only in the months following the May 4th protests that he began to fully commit himself to it. And that summer, he organized several student organizations into an umbrella body to protest against the Japanese presence in Shandong. This is the first clear sign of his abilities as an organizer. And his writings around this time and into 1920 began to speak of the Army of the Red Flag and to the victories won by the communists in Russia by the time that the Communist Party of China was formally established in the summer of 1921. Mao had proclaimed himself to be a communist, believing that the ideology would be the basis for the coming revolution in China. It would be a slow ascent towards that revolution. However, in the meantime, Mao married again in 1920 to Yang Kai, the daughter of one of his former teachers. Then, in July 1921, he attended the first Congress of the Communist Party of China. Decision was taken early on by the new party to accept aid from Russia, but also to establish an alliance with Sun Yat-sen's Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, which would soon be led by a younger nationalist by the name of Chiang Kai-Mao, was one of the first of the Chinese communists to also join the Nationalist Party, in the belief that the conservative Chinese political establishment would only be overthrown if the nationalists and the communists worked in league with each other. As such, he spent much of the 1920s living in the nationalist stronghold of Guangdong province and working as an organizer and propagandist for both the communists and the nationalists simultaneously in Mahan. Throughout this period, Mao was gaining a greater appreciation of the struggles of the Chinese peasantry throughout the country and the strength in sheer numbers which they had. If they were won over to the communist cause as such, the early and mid-1920s were formative. If somewhat unremarkable years in Mao's career, this all began to change in 1926, with the death of Sun Yat-sen in 1925. Chiang Kai-shek had taken over the leadership of the nationalists, by this time his party. The Kuomintang had control over large parts of southern China. But the country was still highly fragmented, with the conservative government of the Republic holding Beijing and much of the north, and quasi-independent Chinese warlords, who were vestiges of the imperial past, holding other parts of the country in 1926. Chiang determined to force the issue and launched a nationalist military campaign to seize Beijing. The Northern Expedition, as it has become known, was a major success. And during the course of 1926 and 1927, nationalists seized power in many of the major cities. But the very success of the Northern Expedition also led to civil war. Now the loose alliance, which the Chinese communists and the nationalists had been in since 1921, was effectively ended by Chiang Kai-shek, who had grown wary of the expanding power of the communists and the role Russia wished to play in China. Once the conservative regime in Beijing was done away with, the result was a split itself within the Nationalist Party in 1927, between Chiang's right-leaning nationalists and a left-leaning faction which wished to accommodate the communists. These events are typically seen as the beginning of the Chinese Civil War, which would last for over 20 years. In the summer of 1927, Chiang Kai-shek's newly ascendant Kuomintang began a crackdown on communists throughout China. Thousands were killed, and the party was suppressed in many places. Mao's reaction to this major setback and the inception of civil war between the nationalists and the communists was to retreat with several hundred followers into the wilder U.S. around the Jinggang Mountains on the border of Hunan province. It was the beginning of a long period of guerrilla warfare, during which the Communist Party, with tacit aid from Russia, sought to disrupt the rule of the nationalists in anticipation of mass urban revolts by workers throughout the country against the new government. These were often tough years for Mao. His wife and sister were beheaded by the nationalists in 1930. Though in his new life as a guerrilla fighter in rural China, he had formed a relationship with her June, whom he married soon after Yang Kaiyu was killed. It was also around this time that he determined on a new course. Instead of waiting for a revolt of the Chinese urban proletariat, he would attempt the same strategy as had brought the Chinese nationalists to power, building up a territory which he would control and expand outwards. In February 1930, Mao, who by now was one of the senior commanders of the Chinese Communist movement, established the Southwest Jiangxi Provincial Soviet government in Jiangxi province. Although the nationalists controlled most of the country for a few years here in the early 1930s, Mao established a Chinese Soviet state in Jiangxi, with him serving as the chairman. The Red Army had also expanded and was now under the overall control of Zhou Enlai, with the wider Chinese Communist Party focusing attentions on Jiangxi as a safe base for them in the early 1930s. Indeed, Mao Enlai and the Red Army saw off several efforts by Chiang Kai-shek to wrest control of the province back from them in the early 1930s by encircling Jiangxi. However, this military response was limited by the nationalists, in part because it had found itself embroiled in a conflict on the other side of China in the early 1930s, as the Empire of Japan invaded the northeastern Chinese provinces of Manua and established a puppet state called Manuka there. It was just the beginning of heightened Japanese involvement in China in the 1930s. But once the initial furore concerning Manchuria died down, Chiang set his sights on finally reclaiming Zhejiang in the Levin province from Mao and the communists in the mid-1930s. In September 1933, the Chinese nationalists began the fifth encirclement of Mao and the communists in Jiangxi province. This effectively involved an enormous siege by the nationalists, and one which would prove too large for the Red Army to repulse by the summer of 1934. It was clear that Mao and his followers would either have to surrender or break out of the besieged area they chose, the latter, and the resulting events have become part of Communist Party law. In October 1934, Communist forces consisting of 86,000 troops, 15,000 personnel, and 35 women broke through nationalist enemy lines and began an epic retreat from their encircled headquarters in southwest China. The Long March, as it became known, lasted 368 days and covered 6,000 mi. They crossed 24 rivers and 18 mountain ranges. Weapons and supplies were borne on the backs of fighters or in horse-drawn carts, and at times the line of marchers stretched for 50 mi only 4. Zhao's troops completed the journey, enduring starvation, aerial bombardment, and almost daily skirmishes with nationalist forces. Mao eventually halted his columns at the foot of the Great Wall of China. The Long March is regarded as the longest continuous march in the history of warfare, and marked the emergence of Mao Zedong as the undisputed leader of the Chinese Communists. The months after the Long March saw a curious drift in Chinese politics towards a schism between the Communists and the Nationalists. For years, the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek had been dealing with problems on multiple fronts. As well as the Communists, there was the perhaps greater problem posed by the Empire of Japan and its ambitions to dominate the Far East politically and militarily. This had already resulted in the invasion of Manua and the establishment of the puppet state of Manchukuo in the early 1930s. But as the years went by, it was clear that the emperor's government in Tokyo had ambitions for an even greater land grab. In China, accordingly, many within the nationalist movement believed it would be best to put aside their differences with the communists for the foreseeable future and form a coherent opposition to the impending Japanese attack. And for their part, Mao and his followers were encouraged to do the same by Moscow. Thus, during the course of 1935 and 1936, Mao's communists and Chiang Kai-shek nationalists were once again drifting towards an alliance of convenience. The drive towards doing so was accelerated in July 1937, when the Japanese again invaded China and proceeded to militarily occupy many of the major cities along its eastern coast, massacring tens of thousands of Chinese civilians in cities such as Nanjing. In the process, the Chinese Civil War now morphed into the Second Sino-Japanese War, and in turn, that would become a constitutive part of the Second World War in later years. By the end of 1937, the Communists and the Nationalists were formally allied with each other again, after Chiang Kai-shek caved in to pressure to do so from within his own ranks. And Mao also married again, around this time, to Jiang Qing, an actress who would become his fourth and final wife, as an example of his growing ruthlessness. His former wife, June, was packed off to the Soviet Union, where she was placed in a mental asylum. Meanwhile, the nature of the struggle against Japan, which would play out for the next several years, was beginning to become clear. The nationalists moved inland towards central China as the Japanese occupied the rich cities and farmland of the coastal regions of eastern China here in the inland provinces. The nationalists and the communists would wage a war of attrition with the Japanese to the east for the next few years, and these were significant years. In terms of the support Mao and the communists enjoyed in the course of the late 1930s and early 1940s, Mao's Red Army ballooned in size from approximately 50 to nearly 500,000 fighters. Thus, the war with Japan was finally creating the kind of countrywide support for the Communist Party, which Mao and the other leaders had failed to chire in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Already by 1940, there were signs of Mao's communists being able to win considerable victories against the Japanese occupation forces during a campaign which became known as the 100 Regiments Campaign in August 1940. The 400,000-strong Red Army moved against the Japanese in simultaneous attacks against 5 of the coastal provinces. Attacks which resulted in the deaths of upwards of 20,000 Japanese troops, as well as a severe disruption to Japanese supply routes late 1941 and early 1942 brought setbacks. Although the Japanese made a series of sweeping conquests across the Western Pacific, notably seizing Singapore and Burma from the British and the Philippines from the United States, following the declaration of war on the U.S. in December, with the surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. While these conquests initially put the Japanese in the ascendancy in Eastern Asia, The entry of Japan into the wider Second World War also ensured that the nationalists and the communists now had allies in the shape of the British and Americans, with increased military, financial, and logistical support being received. They were able to ensure that the Japanese occupation of eastern China was never comfortable during the Second World War. As the war was grinding onwards throughout the first half of the 1940s, the Chinese Communist Party continued to grow in power, and so did Mao as its leader. The nature of the war of resistance against the Japanese favored the communists over the nationalists. For starters, the communists were more attuned to how to wage guerrilla war, having done so for many years against the nationalist government in the late 1920s and early 1930s. As a consequence, they were better prepared for doing so against the Japanese, and as they won a series of victories against the Japanese, the Red Army became the more attractive option for Chinese people seeking to oppose the foreign occupation. Moreover, Chiang Kai-shek Kuomintang seemed to many to simply be the Chinese manifestation of the right-wing movements which had brought Japan into China to begin with. And as the Chinese Communist Party, or CPC, expanded in size, Mao also consolidated his control in 1943. He acquired the chairmanship of both the party secretariat and the Politburo of the party for the first time. It was also during these war years that he began affirming that Chinese communism would have a distinctly different shape than that which had developed in Russia. Beijing would be no puppet of Moscow in future years. The nature of the war against the Japanese changed from 1943 onwards as Japan suffered a series of severe setbacks in its struggle against the United States. While its European allies, Germany and Italy, were also fighting an increasingly doomed war against Russia, Britain, and the US. Once the Allies were victorious, all their resources would be employed against the Empire of Japan. Consequently, in the final years of the war, thoughts once again turned to China's politics and who would hold power once the country had been freed from the Japanese as early 1940. There were serious cracks in the alliance between Mao's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, and by 1942, open fighting between the two had broken out yet again as the Chinese Civil War resumed. It would fully erupt again following the end of the Pacific War on the 6th and 9th of August 1945. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, which Japan had occupied all the way back in 1931 as a result within weeks. The Empire of Japan had formally surrendered to the Allies. The Second World War was over, and the Chinese Civil War once more commenced between the nationalists and Mao's communists. Mao was in a far more advantageous position in 1945 than he had been 10 years earlier after the Long March. If the Long March had kept the Chinese Communist movement alive, then the Japanese invasion of China in 1937 and the 8 years of war with Japan allowed the Communists to strengthen their position immensely. In a curious twist of history, the Japanese invasion of China indirectly led to the Communists seizing power in the country early in 1946. Mao was handed an extra advantage when Stalin handed over Manchuria to the Chinese Communist Party. Yet it would take 3 years of further intense fighting between the Communists and the Nationalists before a breakthrough was made in September 1948. The Communists secured full control of east-central China in the region south of Beijing with the capture of Shandong province in the Hahai campaign. Then in the winter of 1948, Mao launched the Pingjin campaign against Chiang Kai-shek's forces in northern China. Over a 2-month campaign, over 500,000 nationalist troops were killed, captured or wounded, and the north of the country was left in communist hands, with northern China largely secured by early 1949. Mao and the Red Army commanders took the decision that spring to drive south of the Yi River into the heartland of nationalist-held territory. This was done despite the efforts of the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, to encourage Mao to form a coalition government with the nationalists. Stalin did not want a rival for power amongst the communist leaders, but he would soon have one. On the 23rd of April, 1949. The Red Army seized the nationalist capital of Nanjing. A series of further striking gains saw Chiang Kai retreat south with his remaining supporters to Gwangju by the autumn of 1949. Just weeks later, he and the remaining nationalists decided to make a strategic retreat from the Chinese mainland to the island of Formosa. More commonly known today as Taiwan, here the nationalists formed the government, which they proclaimed as the continuation of the Republic of China, which had been established back in 1911. Meanwhile, back on the mainland, Mao had proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China on the 1st of October 1949. The Chinese Civil War between the communists and the nationalists was at an end. After more than 20 years of conflict, Mao now entered office as the first chairman of the Central People's Government. The first measure to be taken was to tidy up the loose ends of the war. In the spring of 1950, the Red Army launched a campaign against the island of Hainan off the southeast coast of China. Within weeks, the 100,000 strong nationalist forces that were forced to surrender. The international community now expected that Mao would proceed with an invasion of Taiwan. And indeed, even the American government, a longtime supporter of Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, had decided not to recognize his new regime in Taiwan in the belief that it would soon be defeated by Mao and the communists. But no invasion came, and despite numerous crises between the two sides, Taiwan remains self-governing to this day. And this period immediately after the conclusion of the Civil War also saw Mao head to Moscow in the winter of 1949 to 1950. Here he secured large injections of Russian financial support for China, as well as technological advisors, although the agreement came with a tacit admission by Mao of Stalin's primacy. Within the communist world, Mao would have to wait several years before he could attempt to go his own way. The post-war years in China saw the initiation of wide-ranging political, social, and economic reforms. Firstly, a massive land reform campaign was initiated to transfer agricultural land out of the hands of large-scale farmers and landlords and into the hands of poorer peasants. While this reduced economic inequality, it was not without violence. And there were many, many instances of the former landlords being attacked or even murdered across China in the early 1950s. In tandem, a huge drive was initiated to crack down on opium production and consumption across the country, a habit which was partly a legacy of British meddling into the Chinese economy in the 19th century. In the 1950s, millions of opium addicts and habitual users were press-ganged into labor reform camps. They were joined in these by the hundreds of thousands of individuals who Mao's regime branded as counter-revolutionaries, many of them being former members of the Kuomintang. And Mao also launched the new People's Republic onto the world stage by entering into the Korean War, which broke out in the summer of 1950 between a communist North and an American-backed South. Massive Chinese aid ensured that the KONF ended in a stalemate. 3 years later, it also led to a split of relations between Mao's new regime and the United States, one which involved a trade embargo which lasted for over 20 years. In the 1950s, Mao had formed a clear idea of how he believed communism should develop in China. It would be incorrect to assume that Mao Zedong was simply a powermonger who used communist ideology to secure authority in China. Certainly, he was a brutal autocrat, a fact which would become strikingly clear as his long chairmanship continued on into the 1960s and 1970s. But he had also read widely on Marxist-Leninist thought and had a vision for how communism would develop in China in the early 1950s. That vision involved the industrial capacity of China's burgeoning cities of the East Coast and its great rivers, leading the country away from its reliance on agriculture, as Mao described it. The communists had come to power by the Red Army encircling the cities occupied by the nationalists and the Japanese, and then absorbing the cities when they were strong enough. Now the direct opposite was needed. China's cities would need to expand outward and bring the country closer to achieving communism as Marx had intended it. To that end, in 1953, The first five-year plan was initiated in China, in imitation of the five-year plans which the Soviet Union had begun employing in Russia in the 1920s. The first five-year plan of 1953 to 1957 was geared primarily towards reducing the reliance of the Chinese economy on agricultural output and moving towards becoming a global power through the creation of an industrial economy with Soviet financial support and expertise provided through Russian advisors. New factories were built across the country during the plan. Farms were collectivized across China and placed under state management, and billions of yuan were spent in total on completing 595 large and medium-sized infrastructural and economic projects, including railways, major roads, and new dams, often linking parts of China with each other in ways which had never been possible before. As a result, Chinese industrial productivity increased by 128%, and steel production Lun jumped from 35 million tons in 1953 to over 5 million in 1957. Coal extraction doubled during the 5 years, while in agriculture, yields of grain and cotton rose by over 30% during the same time period overall. The first five-year plan under Mao was a tremendous success in pure economic terms. But in its success were the seeds of destruction. For a hubris now entered into Mao and his colleagues, thinking a hubris which would be injected with catastrophic consequences into the second five-year plan. Or as it is more commonly known, the Great Leap Forward on the 22nd of May, 1957. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, who had succeeded Stalin on his death in 1953, delivered a speech at a regional meeting of Soviet representatives, in the course of which he proclaimed that it was his goal that the Soviet Union should catch up and overtake America in economic output by 1980, a few months later, in November 1957. At a gathering in Moscow of international communist leaders to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution, which had brought the Soviets to power in 1917. He repeated his claim, only now he was even more ambitious. The Soviets would now eclipse the Americans. Within 15 years, Mao, who wished for China to rival the Soviet Union and whose relationship with Khrushchev was more antagonistic than it had been with Stalin, began pondering this goal in the aftermath of the Soviet leader's speech. Not to be outdone, he quickly determined to make similar claims and made it known that it was China's goal to catch up with Britain's economy within 15 years and exceed their production of steel and other core industrial outputs. With this goal in mind, in 1958, the Chinese Communist Party initiated the second five-year plan, or what was soon referred to as the Great Leap Forward for the country's economy. It would result in the most catastrophic famine the world has ever seen. Mao believed that the key indicators of how China's economy was progressing would be seen in grain and steel production, if these could be increased rapidly. It would show the Soviets in Moscow and the world in general that China was asserting itself on the world stage. Accordingly, all of the instruments of the state were deployed in 1958 to begin increasing the rate of grain and steel production by establishing new smelting factories and turning ever greater amounts of agricultural land over to grain production. Massive amounts of farmland were collectivized into giant state farms towards this end, and millions of workers were redeployed to different parts of the economy than they were trained for. Huge amounts of state funding were also given out to aid in the effort, and party officials were sent out into the countryside, and the towns charged with maximizing production. However, many of these initiatives were potentially hazardous to begin with, as the state was employing experimental farming methods. In some instances, and in others, was turning over land to grain production, which was more suited to other crops. In other instances, workers were being sent into steel factories with little or no training in what they were doing. It was an inauspicious beginning in 1958, but one which would get much worse over time. Despite the structural issues, there were some initial signs of progress. Steel and iron production did increase in the initial stages of the Great Leap Forward, perhaps by as much as 30 to 40% in 1958. But the mechanism whereby it was being increased would prove catastrophic in some instances in their eagerness to show good results. Local party cardas throughout the country were often resorting to unimaginably short-sighted and brutal tactics. The more cruel methods involved overworking their laborers in the factories to try to have larger amounts of steel produced. But within a few months, party officials throughout the country were also setting up what became known as backyard furnaces, the use of which Mao had actually encouraged. These were essentially makeshift steel furnaces which were often set up. In the yards of people's homes, scrap metal was used to produce pig iron, which was almost totally useless. But the worst thing was that farming tools and other instruments which were needed for producing food throughout the country were often being thrown into these backyard furnaces and melted down, so that local party officials could record higher outputs of alleged steel production in their areas. The result was a lack of basic tools for farming. As the months went by, the effect of all this between 1958 and 1961 was catastrophic, with millions of farmers being press-ganged into working in factories in the cities and towns. There was not enough people available to produce food throughout China, in a country which was often on a subsistence food level. Anyway, added to this was the practice of party officials destroying basic farming equipment to inflate the amount of steel they were producing in their areas. Furthermore, the party had begun trying to use experimental irrigation methods which had rendered large amounts of farmland temporarily unusable in some areas given all this. It is unsurprising that even by the autumn of 1958, just months after the Great Leap Forward had started, there were major food shortages in some parts of the country. And this was further compounded by the fact that the government continued to export grain and other agricultural products in order to increase its revenue and also keep up the appearance that product productivity was increasing by late 1958. People in certain parts of the country were beginning to start foraging for wild foods in the countryside, and others were starving to death. This was just the beginning, though, and by 1959, grain production had fallen by roughly 15 to 20% in total across the country. There is considerable debate as to how much Mao knew about what was unfolding across China as a result of the Great Leap Forward. It is quite possible that in late 1958 and early 1959, he was unaware of the famine conditions, but evidence has been uncovered which suggests he knew by at least the late spring of 1959, and yet did not do enough to change course by 1960 when he delegated control of certain parts of the Great Leap Forward program to others. The Central Party members were actively trying to prevent the worst. But by then, it was too late. The forces which were unleashed in 1958 and 1959 reverberated into 1960 and 1961, and famine struck China over each of these years, with varying degrees of severity. There have been many different estimates of the number of people who died in recent years, as the opening of certain archives in China has allowed for more accurate assessments. But scholars are generally agreed that at least 25 million people died in a country the population of which was approximately 660 million in 1958. Frank Diota, who studied the period in detail and who saw the Great Leap Forward as Mao's Great Famine in the title of his study of these events, suggested the death toll was as many as 55 million. Others would suggest somewhere between 30 and 45 million, making this the most catastrophic famine in human history in terms of sheer numbers of deaths. The second five-year plan, advertised as the Great Leap Forward, came to an end in 1962. Curiously, it was relatively underreported internationally, as much of the information concerning it was transmitted through the Republic of China's government in Taiwan or the British enclave of Hong Kong, and many foreign services believed they were exaggerating the extent of the suffering caused for political purposes. Internally, however, it had badly compromised Mao's leadership. On the 27th of April, 1959, Mao's term as chairman of the People's Republic of China came to an end, although he retained his position as chairman of the Communist Party and of military affairs. He was succeeded by Liu Xiaoyi, and by January 1962, the Great Leap Forward was being wound down. At this time, Liu made a speech at what was to become known as the Seventh. Lushan Conference in which he denounced the Great Leap Forward. It was a very thinly veiled public rebuke of Mao, the likes of which would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. Nevertheless, while Mao had lost some of his authority for now, he was still very much in charge. He would, however, have to govern in a more collective fashion, with figures such as Xiaoqi and Deng Ping, who had done much to recover the economic situation in the wake of the disastrous policies of the late 1950s. The 1960s also saw China increasingly isolated. On the world stage, tensions had been brewing between Mao and the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, ever since the latter succeeded Stalin in the mid-1950s. Mao was particularly perturbed by Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin's brutal authoritarianism and more moderate STS towards the Western powers. He also found himself increasingly at loggerheads with Moscow about the two regimes. Interpretation of orthodox Marxism relations were bad by the late 1950 SS, but they became particularly acute in the early 1960s, especially once the Cuban Missile Crisis inspired KOF to begin working more closely with the U.S. government of John F. Kennedy to defuse the Cold War in ways which Mao opposed. A sign of the split was seen in 1961, when Mao denounced the Soviet regime as revisionist traitors. For his part, Khrushchev was increasingly wary of Mao's attitude towards the possibility of a nuclear war with the West. He once worryingly suggested that if 300 million Chinese people died in a nuclear war, the other half would still be alive to secure victory. And so the Russian leader must have been concerned in 1964 when the Chinese successfully tested their first nuclear bomb. But by then the Sino-Soviet split was complete, while much is known about the political life of the man who oversaw this split with Russia and the catastrophes of the Great Leap Forward. The more private Ma remains something of an enigma. His fourth marriage, that to Jiang Qing in 1938, lasted for the remainder of his life, though Mao engaged in a string of extramarital affairs, including most controversially in his later life, with a private secretary, Zhang Gufang, who was in her early 20s when she first entered Mao's employ. He had at least 10 children, several of whom had been born in the 1920s, and with whom he had very little relationship, as he had had to leave them with others during the long Civil War years. He spent much of his private time writing, and was a prolific composer of political writings and poems, while his reading habits tended to favor traditional Chinese literature. By temperament, he would become aggressive when challenged, but his demeanor was certainly not genuinely unhinged, like Stalin had been in Russia during the 1930s and 1940s. For Ma, state violence was engaged in for political rather than personal purposes. But a great deal about his other personal motivations and inclinations are shrouded behind a public image, which was closely managed during his lifetime. The Sino-Soviet split and the catastrophic consequences of the Great Leap Forward were the background against which Mao initiated what has today become known as simply the Cultural Revolution, but the full name of which was the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, launched in 1966. The Cultural Revolution was designed to be a political and social movement which aimed to purify Chinese society and Chinese communism by removing any of the vestiges of Chinese traditionalism which remained and the capitalist and BG elements within it. Mao claimed that a bis bureaucracy had developed within the Chinese Communist Party that was leading China in the wrong direction. And this, along with communist revisionists, such as those who were now in power in Russia, needed to be stopped, and a renewed dedication to the communist cause developed in particular. Mao called on the younger generations of China, those which had been born after the Second World War, and who had never known life in China before. Communist rule to bombard the headquarters, to purify Chinese society of these bourgeois capitalist elements. And to reinvigorate the communist movement, there has been a widespread debate as to what Mao's motivations for launching the Cultural Revolution were. Some historians have argued that he genuinely believed that the Chinese Communist Party and the huge administration which operated under it throughout China had been compromised by nearly 20 years in power, and that a cultural reawakening was necessary to stop the bureaucratic degeneration of the country. However, While this might have been a motivating factor for Mao, there is no doubt that the Cultural Revolution was primarily conceived as a way for the chairman to resuscitate his control over the Communist Party and the country as a whole. By its very nature, the movement allowed Mao to use the party's apparatus and wider organs of the state to purge the government of his opponents and competing factions. These had multiplied in number in the early 1960s as the catastrophic impact of the Great Leap Forward W was felt across the country. Now, Mao would eliminate those who had dared to cross him in the most brutal purges seen within the Chinese Communist Party. The result would be years of unrest, which turned ordinary Chinese people against each other and created an environment of fear and suspicion. The Cultural Revolution was initiated in May 1966, with Mao urging the people and students in particular to act to purify by the party ranks. Within weeks, gangs of students were attacking their teachers, intellectuals, government officials, and even people who were deemed to be wearing bourgeois clothing. These attacks could range from being mild to moderately violent, such as when teachers were attacked by gangs of students and had their heads shaved, to truly bloody acts, such as when government officials were actually murdered or driven to commit suicide as the frenzy built up in the summer of 1996's official party. Newspapers stoked the flames by calling on the masses to clear away the evil habits of the old society and attack the monsters and demons. By now, students in classrooms and on college campuses across China were organizing themselves into bands of so-called Red Guards, committed to preserving the communist revolution and rooting out what were termed the four olds: old ideas, old customs, old habits, and old culture. By the early autumn, gangs of teenagers wearing red armbands roamed the streets of cities such as Beijing and Shanghai, and the unrest was so visceral that August became known as Red August. Soon the initial student-led violence spread to other groups, and factory workers and laborers on collectivized farms began joining what was termed the Red Terror. Meanwhile, Mao was directing these groups as best they could be directed against his enemies within the government and the wider party apparatus. But as a means of purging the party of his opponents, this was a very unstable method by 1967. Radical elements were threatening to move beyond Mao's ability to control them. But the Cultural Revolution nevertheless continued in 1968. Mao initiated the down to the countryside, whereby the children of supposed middle-class, bourgeois urban families were forced into what were effectively re-education camps in the countryside. Meanwhile, the chairman was building up an ever greater cult of personality around himself, in part led by the publication of his Little Red Book, a collection of his sayings and writings, which became central to the concept of Maoism in China around this time. The violence continued unabated through the late 1960s, but by 1971, even Mao was aware of the need to scale things back. And though the Cultural Revolution is deemed by some to have only ended with Mao's death in 1976, the worst of the unrest subsided in the early 1970s. As with the enormous famine created by the Great Leap Forward 10 years earlier, historians have found it difficult to precisely identify how many people died as a result of the Cultural Revolution. Estimates tend to vary between 500,000 and 2 million people having lost their lives as a result of the violence which swept through China between 1966 and 1971. Many of these were killed by the Red Guards, and other groups triggered into fanaticism by Mao's injunctions. However, probably the greater proportion of these lost their lives in instances where the army was called in to quell the unrest, or by the army and the Communist Party being directed to purge certain groups by Mao himself. Just as damaging was the psychological pain inflicted on a society where people were effectively turned against each other by the state. Perhaps the most glaring example of this occurred in Guangdong province in the south of the country, where between 100,000 and 150,000 lives were lost during the Cultural Revolution. People here even resorted to burying the persecuted alive, or boiling or disemboweling them. And there was systematic cannibalism engaged in Guangdong as the frenzied masses sought to literally devour their enemy. In their fervor, ultimately, the Cultural Revolution scarred Chinese society in ways which are hard to quantify. The early 1970s witnessed a major event in China's relations on the international stage, which has had important implications down to the present day. Chinese involvement in the Korean War had seen diplomatic ties between the People's Republic and the United States government effectively shut down with trade sanctions imposed on China by Washington. However, with the passage of 20 years, both sides were cautiously investigating the possibility of re-establishing diplomatic ties during the course of the 1968 U.S. presidential election. The Republican candidate Richard Nixon had proposed making overtures to China to that effect, and after he entered office, negotiations commenced in 1971. Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, went on a secret diplomatic mission to Beijing, and this was followed in February 1972 by an official state visit in China by Nixon, during the course of which he met Mao, the first meeting between a Chinese and American head of state since the Second World War, which has grown ever greater in importance since, and which is now regarded by many as the most significant international relationship between two states in the world. Despite the veneer of normality which was lent to us Chinese relations by the official state visit of Nixon in 1972, at home the Chinese government continued to operate in an extreme fashion. By the time Nixon visited, Mao was nearly 70 years of age, and owing to years of chain smoking, he was suffering from numerous physical ailments. It was due to this, and the cult of personality which he had built up around himself, that he allowed a number of senior Communist Party members to become immensely influential in China. In his final years, these were known as the Jiang of Four, which consisted of Mao's wife Jiang Qing, Jiang Chung-Xia, an ultra-maced writer, who had come to prominence during the 1960s for his denunciation of Bijia elements within Chinese society. A close ally of Chun Chia's Ya W. Yen and Wang Hungan, a younger political figure who had risen from within the Shanghai branch of the Chinese Communist Party to become one of its highest-ranking figures. During the Cultural Revolution, the Gang of Four had done much to promote the worst excesses of the Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1971. But even after the most extreme period of the purges ended in the late 1960s, their influence over Mao's government continued the last years of Mao's life, and his primacy in the politics of China are hard to characterize, as competing forces were at work. In the halls of power in Beijing, certainly, Mao remained wedded to the idea of clinging to power until the very end. As a result, he continued to allow the Gang of Four and their supporters to hold considerable influence in the country. However, separately, there was a growing clique of individuals who coalesced around other older stalwarts of the party, such as the former head of the Red Army and Premier Zhou Enlai, and the former General Secretary of the party, Deng Xiaoping, who wished to break from some of the more traditional ideological values of the party espoused by M and introduce a greater degree of professionalism into the running of the government and the economy. There was also much bitterness within the party establishment at the damage wrought by the Cultural Revolution, as individuals who had fought the Japanese and the nationalists in the 1930s and 1940s had often been purged from the party in the late 1960s, only to be gradually rehabilitated in the 1970s. Acrimony between all these groups characterized the politics of China in the final years of Mao's life, and it was he himself who was largely responsible for creating this situation. The political uncertainty of the post-Cultural Revolution period was still unresolved. As Mao entered the final stages of his life, his health had further deteriorated in the mid-1970s, and he was suffering from several heart and lung ailments, the latter aggravated considerably by his chain smoking. While there were unconfirmed rumors of a considerable reliance on sleeping pills, which had developed over the years, on the 27th of May 1976, he met the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Sulika Alibo, on a state visit at which the last known photo of Mao was taken. But by then he had already suffered the first of several heart attacks that occurred between the spring and autumn of 1976, and which left him increasingly incapacitated. The final one on the 5th of September left him largely unable to move, and he died. 4 days later. A state funeral lasting a week followed between the 11th and the 18th of September 1976, during which 1 million Chinese people filed past his body today. The enormous Malum of Hmong housing. His embalmed body stands in the middle of Tiananmen Square in central Beijing, on the site where the Gate of China, the southern gate of the old imperial city, between the 14th and the 20th centuries, used to stand before its destruction in 1954. It is perhaps fitting as a statement of where ancient China ended and modern China began. Mao's death occurred at a time when the older leadership of the entire Chinese Communist Party, the generation who had come to political consciousness during the May 4th movement all the way back in 1919, was fading from Chinese life. The old leader of the Red Army and a possible successor to Mao Zedong. Li had predeceased Mao by just a few months. Consequently, Mao had appointed the Minister for Public Security, Hua Guang, as his successor. Shortly before his death, he succeeded as chairman of the Chinese Communist Party in 1976. But he would not last long. Guang was outmaneuvered in the years that followed by Deng Xiaoping, who became the de facto leader of China in 1978. Though Guang's brief period as leader was significant in arresting and charging the Gang of Four as being responsible for the excesses of the Cultural Revolution. In all but one instance, they subsequently was sentenced to life in prison under Deng Xiaoping's leadership. Elsewhere, despite his impeccable communist credentials, Deng Xiaoping quickly moved China away from its planned economy and the more authoritarian aspects of Mao's reign, setting term limits on the holding of office. It was during Deng's tenure as Mao's successor that the roots of China's economic miracle can really be found, as he opened the country up to foreign investment and expertise. Thus, in the end, Mao proved to be the impediment to China's growth rather than the deliverer of it. Meng is one of the most contentious individuals in Chinese history, and indeed the history of the modern world. To some, he was a brutal tyrant and a mass murderer, under whose rule between 1949 and 1946, over 50 million people, and perhaps as many as 80 million, died prematurely, whether as a result of the catastrophic failures of the Great Leap Forward, the waves of violence unleashed during the Cultural Revolution, or government-orchestrated disasters such as the Bansha Dam failure of 1975, which by some estimates resulted in the deaths of over 200,000 people. However, to many others, he is one of the great heroes of modern-day China. The man who ensured that the cause of Chinese communism survived during the Long March of the 1930s. The commander who led Chinese resistance to the Japanese occupation during the Second World War, and the individual who thereafter led the Red Army to victory over the nationalists. Many who focus on his achievements will also point towards the fact that life expectancy rates and living standards in China increased dramatically between the 1940s and the 1970s, and argue that Mao laid the basis for China's economic miracle, which began in the late 20th century. It is indeed striking that one individual can provoke such widely diverging opinions. There is no doubting Mao's critical role in ensuring the ascent to power of the Communist Party in China. Without Mao, the movement might not have survived the 1930s, and his leadership was also critical in the post-war period. But once he secured power, this individual, who was clearly possessed of a considerable intellect and ability, became obsessed with retaining and expanding his control of China at the expense of lives and social stability. It was his desire to not play second fiddle to Krov and the Russians, which drove China into the disastrous Great Leap Forward, and his unwillingness to accept how badly things had gone wrong, which saw the famine, which the Second Five-Year Plan created, drag on for years and kill somewhere between 30 and 50 million Chinese people. It was Mao's pathological desire to reinforce his position as head of the Chinese state in the mid-1960s, which led to the violence and instability of the Cultural Revolution. The Mao of the 1950s and 1960s was a different one to the individual who first joined the party in 1921 and initiated the Long March in 1934. Those who knew him over the course of his life often confirmed that he changed considerably over the years. What do you think of Mao Zedong? Do you think he was actually committed to the idea of communism? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.